It's, once again, I can't thank Dave Dickerson enough and the Citizens for Liberty for all that they're doing to keep these things of our heritage alive, and which we miss so dearly these days. We're happy to do that. I'm happy somebody's in the front row. It's very nice that somebody's in the front row. It seemed to, of course, September 17th is Constitution Day, and what we're doing here is for Constitution Week. And I've noticed that one of the things that I haven't typically done that I need to do is kind of go over the structure of the Constitution in the first place and get things started, because actually we're going to concentrate more on kind of an obscure section of the Constitution, Article 6. People talk a lot about some of the articles, and so it's important for us to understand that there is, in fact, a structure that starts with the preamble. Article 1 describes the powers, duties of Congress. It's the one that actually delegates the authority to Congress. It gives the enumerated powers that that Congress doesn't pay too much attention to these days for any number of reasons. Then Article 2 involves, of course, there's only 1,000 some odd words to describe what's become the most powerful person in the world. Article 3 gives the powers and authority of the Supreme Court. Strangely enough, Article 3 only creates the Supreme Court. All the inferior courts are created through Article 3 power delegated to the Congress. The Congress has the authority to create the lower courts, and have in fact done so with that system of trial courts and then appellate courts and then the Supremes. Article 4 is government relations. Strangely enough, it talks about how states interact with each other, and the obligations of states to each other, and then the obligations, strangely enough, of the federal government to the states. Again, something else that does not get a lot of attention. Article 5, I think, probably, given the fact that this group is interested in things, Article 5 is the amendment process. Describes actually 2 ways to amend the Constitution, one of which is proposed amendments by the Congress. The other one is a system whereby states themselves can propose amendments. We've never, ever used that. There's any number of current movements to create what they would call a convention of states, to amend the Constitution outside the Congress. It was a very, very important addition to the Constitution near the end of the process, but strangely enough, we've never used it. It was added there in the anticipation that some place in the future Congress would never get around to limiting its own authority. And so there's movements these days to do that. Article 6 is something we're going to talk about, part of it at any rate, in a little bit of detail. It does some housekeeping matters regarding the debts that were outstanding at the end of the Revolutionary War and that were carried over to the Confederation government under the Articles of Confederation. And then the supremacy clauses there, and that's the one that in fact indicates that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The last article of the Constitution is Article 7, ratification, and that was described the process by which the Constitution would be adopted. When 9 of the then existing 13 states ratified the Constitution, it would in fact go into effect, and which ultimately took place on March 4th, 1789, and when the Constitution actually went into effect. Spend just a moment about September 17th. September 17th was the day that, in fact, they finished writing the Constitution, and the delegates of the convention all voted to adopt the Constitution and send it out to the states for the ratification process in Article 7. What many people don't know, and regularly these days we unfortunately hear the founding fathers kind of disparaged as a bunch of rich old white guys. And other kind of disparaging commentary on these gentlemen, was on the very first day, they wrote the Constitution, finished it up in what we now call Independence Hall. But at that time, it was also the seat of government for the state of Pennsylvania. It was also where the Pennsylvania legislature sat. And while they had to send it out by horseback everywhere around to all the other states, all they really had to do for Pennsylvania was take a copy of the Constitution and walk it upstairs, where the Pennsylvania legislature sat. And what the Pennsylvania legislature did in the first few days, right after they got it, is they ordered 4,500 copies of the Constitution to be printed. The interesting thing about that, though, is it was for distribution among the people of Pennsylvania so that they could obtain the consent of the government as laid out in the Declaration of Independence. But only 3,000 of those copies were printed in English. 1,500 copies on the very first day that the Constitution was printed for distribution among the people. 1,500 of the copies in Pennsylvania were printed in German. The movement to grow the people of the we the people and make sure everybody was included, and the movement for inclusion started on the very first day. Fully 1/3 of the people in Pennsylvania did not speak English. Fully 1/3 of the people in Pennsylvania were more comfortable in German than any other language. And the founding fathers, including the folks that represented Pennsylvania in their legislature, understood that if you were going to gain the consent of the government needed to understand what the heck they were consenting to. And so to disparage this whole group as sort of the top 1%ers who had no interest in including the other people that made up the United States or the future in the United States, because the Articles of Confederation were sort of more like a treaty organization among sovereign nations. So they understood the need to include people and grow the people that were included in this process right from the very first day, and we've been growing ever since. As an aside, New York, before it was New York, had been New Amsterdam, and New Amsterdam, of course, was founded by the Dutch, and there remained in 1787 a significant Dutch population in New York. And so when the Constitution got up to New York and they went to publish it for distribution around the state of New York, it was not only published in English, but it was also published in Dutch. So I think that story kind of tells what the Constitution set in motion, that we're still working on, but it kind of sets the tone for what was going on in that circumstance. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about Article 6, some background, some personal background on this situation. Article 6, one of the things in Article 6, one of the important things in Article 6, indicates that all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. And that also, I've got that section there, but it also included all legislative officers early on in the section. And Article 6, the oath provisions of Article 6 are kind of interesting because of the purpose. Right, and still by 1787, generally speaking, if somebody talked about my country and they were from Virginia, they meant Virginia. When they talked about my country and they were from Massachusetts, they were talking about Massachusetts. Hardly anybody referred to the United States of America as their country. And one of the goals of this provision in Article 6 indicated that everybody in every government office, from the lowest levels to the highest levels, took an oath or affirmation to support the Constitution. And the purpose of that was to start to build a nation. to have people understand that what they were supporting was in fact the United States of America, and try and overcome the natural inclination to say my country is South Carolina, or my country is Massachusetts, my country is Virginia. So the aspect of that was very, very important. And so ultimately, that filtered down to just about everything. And on a personal note, I've had to take that, I've taken such an oath 8 different times in my life. The first time, I'd gone to law school, I'd been to school for 19 years to become a lawyer, and I took the bar exam in June of 1987, July of 1987. I graduated school in June of '87. I took the bar in July. We had to wait a couple of months for the bar results, because they did something called the character and fitness examination, where they did a background investigation and found out if generally you were an overall decent human being. Well, in September, I got the results that said I passed the bar and I was going to be admitted to practice law. And they said, come to this ceremony and whatnot at Erie Crown Theater in McCormick Place in downtown Chicago. There was going to be about 1,200 lawyers sworn in at that particular thing, and I got that. And a few weeks later, I heard from somebody that a lawyer never wants to hear from. You never want to hear from the Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Committee. You never want to hear from these people. The ARDC is the most hated acronym in at least in an Illinois attorney's mind. And not long after I got the notice that I had passed and was going to be sworn in, I got another note that said, by the way, you're not going to join that class. You're not going to get sworn in with those people in the Erie Crown Theater, and you got to come down here in about 5 or 6 weeks for a hearing. This was very disturbing. I called lawyer friends, I called my classmates, I called my school law professors, I called everybody. I was trying to know what is going on, because the ARDC is a pretty secretive organization. They don't really tell people what's going on. And so eventually I wound up going down to the ARDC, and they explained to me what they thought was going on. And they said, you know, we understand that, or we believe, we have reason to believe that you're practicing law without a license, because you haven't been sworn in yet. Well, after I got the information that I'd been admitted, or that I'd passed the bar, or you're not admitted until you take the oath, I put a message on my answering machine. Of course, we didn't have voicemail, we had regular answering machines. And I put a message on there that said, you've reached Dave Shestokas, attorney at law. I'll be playing golf Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and I'll be playing golf Wednesday morning. I might be available on Wednesday. I'm kind of making light of the fact that people think attorneys spend a lot of time on the golf course. And I thought it was pretty funny. The people at the ARDC didn't think it was so funny. And they didn't tell me about that. And I explained to them, I said, no, I haven't been doing anything. I haven't taken any clients. I just thought that this was a humorous little message to announce to people that I in fact passed the bar. And they didn't take it so funny. And somehow or other that brought home to me the importance of the oath of office that attorneys take. Of course, you can't go to a judge and indicate that you need a continuance because you have a tee time. And so eventually, though, they came around, but I missed the big ceremony at Erie Crown Theater, and I didn't get sworn in with the 1,200 other lawyers. As it turns out, I wound up in a private ceremony with a appellate court judge and my mom, my dad, my sister, my uncle, and turned out to be a very nice thing, but my goodness, it was a horrible 6 weeks. It was a horrible 6 weeks because everything I'd been working for all my life was in jeopardy because I had left a funny message on my answering machine. So they didn't think it was so funny, but eventually they moved us along to where we had to where I had the opportunity to take the oath of office of attorneys, because attorneys are considered to be officers of the court, and as officers of the court, you're a member of the judicial branch. And being a member of the judicial branch, you fall under Article 6 of the Constitution and the requirement to take an oath to support the Constitution. Those are September 17, 1787, but we have to go back, and you wind up taking the oath of office for a number of reasons. We've talked about the one, grabbing people together. But as we talk back about the structures of the government, you find some of the purposes in the preamble. And while you find purposes in the preamble, you don't really find why people go out and are willing to commit their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the Constitution. The Constitution is really kind of a information or structure. It contains a lot of structural matters. It contains that people aren't going to go die so the president can serve 4 years. They're not going to go die so that a Supreme Court justice can have a lifetime appointment. They're not going to go die so that tax bills have to originate in the House of Representatives. The Constitution is obviously very, very important in some way. In many ways, it's critical. However, it is a mechanical outline of the structures of government, and its purpose is to execute the Declaration of Independence. People, when they swear support for the Constitution, because as I say, the whole oath of office was not told them, the importance of it and those aspects of it weren't even taught to me in law school. And it started me thinking about what it was that I was actually swearing to support, and what it was that I was going to drive my work for as an attorney, eventually a prosecutor, eventually in a small way an elected official. What I was actually supporting, and the real place. There's so many. I know you've heard this phrase. That's not who we are as Americans, right? But nobody ever says who we are as Americans. They always just go, well, that's not who we are, and disparage whatever it is that they want to disparage. But they never really give us an opportunity or a description of what it is that we are. Well, there's a place to find it. There's a place to find who we are as Americans. And in fact, it's found in the Declaration of Independence, which was adopted by the first Congress as law of the United States of America. People don't die for the structures of the Constitution. People die because we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We talked about this yesterday briefly, that regularly over our lifetimes, probably most of us have had an opportunity to memorize the preamble to the Constitution, we the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union. Nobody really, that's kind of a mission statement. And while it's critically, while it has its place and is critically important, nobody really takes the time to understand this as the American creed. As the American creed, it is what really does give us purpose. It really is what defines us as Americans. And it's so often overlooked and unfortunately not taught on a consistent basis, if taught it ever. Regularly, we don't look at the Declaration of Independence. I had actually written constitutional soundbites a couple of years ago, and in constitutional soundbites, it has 150 questions and answers about the Constitution, Declaration, and Bill of Rights. I got done with the book, and during sort of the editing process, I started reading, and I saw all these different mentions of the Declaration of Independence. And through the course of that, I discovered that while I'd answered 150 questions primarily about the Constitution, there were actually 140 mentions of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration, and so that's what ultimately motivated me to move along for creating the Declaration of Independence. That I wanted to do what I could to bring to light the importance of the Declaration of Independence in the formation of the Constitution and how that actually came about. And there's a fellow that's a much better scholar of the Declaration than I am.
Really?
Yeah, there was a much better scholar of the Declaration of Independence than I. And Abraham Lincoln in 1859, a couple of years before he became president, took note of the importance of the Declaration of Independence with this commentary: all honor to Jefferson, to the man who had the coolness, forecasting capacity to introduce an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, that today and in all coming days shall be a stumbling block to reappearing tyranny and oppression. It only remains a stumbling block to tyranny and oppression, of course, if we understand it and pass it along. And so that's become part of my current mission, is to try and draw attention to the importance of the Declaration of Independence and actually understanding the Constitution. Because the Declaration is the inspiration, and we're going to talk a little bit. In fact, the Declaration of Independence is actually the legitimate legal authority for the existence of the United States. Absent the Declaration of Independence and the theories that we operate under, the United States doesn't have a legitimate legal basis for its existence. So the 55 crucial words that start with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and wind up with the consent of the government, that ultimately would grow out of a resolution by a fellow known as Richard Henry Lee. And Richard Henry Lee is one of the largely overlooked founders, and it's too bad. When I decided I was going to do something about the Declaration of Independence, it was hard to determine where to start. And ultimately, after some investigation, we're going to talk about that in a minute, it seemed like June 7th, 1776 was really the first place to start. Because that was the day that Richard Henry Lee stood up in the Continental Congress and proposed, he was the first person to propose publicly independence for the United States of America in a public legal form. So Richard Henry Lee's contribution is just incredible, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. But ultimately, while he proposed that, the Continental Congress did what did Senator Thomas? When somebody puts forward something to a legislative body, what happens to it in the first instance?
You mean on the bill?
Bill, resolution, somebody drops it in the hopper, what happens to it?
Well, it's assigned to a committee.
Exactly. And Richard Henry Lee proposed a resolution for independence, and the first thing the Second Continental Congress did was form 3 committees. They didn't jump all over it right at the beginning. They formed 3 committees, and they kind of referred that to a committee. So that was the first thing. One of the committees was a committee for the creation of the Declaration of Independence. They thought in case we did this, we might need to explain what we're doing. They also created a committee to outline a potential organization of a government should they become independent, and also they formed a committee for the purpose of communicating with foreign nations. So the first thing they did was form a committee. Jefferson went to work. We're going to talk a little bit about how that happened. And then beyond those 55 words, there's 8 other critical words in the Declaration of Independence. and that is, those words are the law of nature and nature's God. Declaration of Independence really, when you come down to it, resembles very well. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was an attorney. We won't hold that against him. On the rich old white guy business, he was only 33, which made me feel bad because that was when I discovered that, because I was 33 when I got sworn in as a lawyer. So I felt I was a little bit behind Jefferson. But he was only 33. But the law of nature and nature's God. I'm sure many of you have followed it, some aspect or another of the Kavanaugh hearings. And regularly the term comes up about how we are supposed to be governed by the rule of law. They never mention the second part of that formulation. We're supposed to be governed by the rule of law, not the rule of men. Okay? Well, if we're not going to be governed by the rule of men, there obviously has to be something bigger than the rule of men that men don't have the ability to change. So the 8 critical words, the law of nature and of nature's God, in the Declaration of Independence, give the authority for a law that is unalterable, that can't be changed by men. And that's the place where things start. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means in a moment. This is here for emphasis. I see you squint a little bit. You can see this, right, Senator?
I got a sore in my eye. That's why I was squinting. I'm sorry.
No, not a problem.
It is.
But I need some.
It's perfectly clear. Yeah,
you can read it?
yeah, it's just irritation in my eye. That's all.
Would you share that with us?
Okay, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
All right.
If nothing else from today, I would love for everyone here to take away that this, in fact, is the American creed. This is who we are as Americans. This is what's supposed to define us.
Yeah, but
Prior to the Declaration of Independence, the whole world actually had been ruled pretty much for 10,000 years on the assumption that some men were actually born to rule others. Declaration of Independence was the very first time in the history of the world, in the 10,000 years of human history, that there was going to be, with that, a small tip of the hat to a short-lived period of time in the Roman Republic. I only know that because I studied some Latin. But otherwise, you wouldn't know that. But really, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, the world was ruled by chiefs and kings and despots and sultans and emirs. That had all been, and that'd been the tradition of the world and world government. So Thomas Jefferson went about trying to figure out what he's supposed to write. And so he studied some history and recalled the history that he already knew, and started looking at the history of the world and what they were going to do when they announced independence. And he of course, ran across the Magna Carta. He kind of discarded much of the Magna Carta because the Magna Carta, while it says a lot of things and it's been interpreted, it was kind of dead for 400 years till a council to a king decided that since he could read Latin and the king couldn't, he could explain it to the king and tell the king anything he wanted. And say, well, you're bound by the Magna Carta. He says, well, what does it say? I can't read Latin. And he says, well, it says this, and it says, I'm supposed to be in charge, not you. And so, and Jefferson was aware of that particular situation. He was also aware of the King John in 1215 when he signed on to the Magna Carta. He did so with a knife in his throat, and it wasn't exactly a situation that was worked out well. So, but those were the things. But ultimately, Jefferson was trying to explain what he considered to be the American mind. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Jefferson. But now, June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee stands up in the Second Continental Congress and does something that nobody had done ever before for a couple of, or at least one very, very good reason. Because uttering independence in a formal setting, in a public circumstance, and proposing that the country would become independent, meant that he was actually committing treason against the king. There were a couple of folks that had done so publicly. We saw earlier the cover of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Thomas Paine had mentioned independence publicly, and perhaps Patrick Henry, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, had done so, but nobody had done so in a public setting in an official circumstance. They whispered about it at a place in Philadelphia called City Tavern over beers on a regular basis, but nobody did so in a public setting. So on June 7, 1776, June 6, 1776, Richard Henry Lee stood up, indicated, resolved that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, that is the king, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be dissolved. So Richard Henry Lee got up and actually publicly committed treason. The Congress, generally speaking, said, we're going to, with the single exception of John Adams, who seconded the motion, seconded the resolution, and joined Richard Henry Lee in the public commission of treason. The rest of them said, oh, let's send this to a committee. And they did in fact send this to the committee. But the reason, one of the reasons that they never talked about it publicly is that they were committing treason. Now, treason was really serious business. Treason against the king was very serious business. And among the reasons they didn't want to do it was because there was penalties outlined in British law for treason. And the first penalty was, of course, to have your gut cut open and your entrails kind of left hanging. And the second part of that treason penalty was to be hung by the neck, but you were supposed to be cut down before you died. And after you got cut down before you died, then they hooked you up to horses and things and drawn and quartered you. And assuming basically at that point you were still alive, they would cut off your head. Most of these guys didn't want to be beheaded. You know, they were kind of anti-having their heads cut off. Now, I was a prosecutor for quite a while, and then I've been doing criminal justice, and many of the laws have, in the criminal system, have tremendous, terrible penalties, you know, whether it's life, death, life without parole, death, sometimes 5, 10 years for selling small amounts of drugs, whatever. But in my experience, almost nobody ever gets the terrible penalty. You know, it just doesn't work out that way. But to understand what was going on for these guys at that particular moment in time, they actually knew people who in fact had their heads cut off. The most prominent that comes to mind is a fellow by the name of Dr. Joseph Warren. Dr. Warren was general in the Massachusetts militia. He was the president of the Massachusetts provincial legislature. He probably would have been one of the more prominent founding fathers had he not been severely wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And ultimately, after the battle was over, British execution squads went out and to see whether or not there was any Americans still alive. And the execution folks did, in fact, see to it that whatever surviving Americans they found didn't survive anymore. And Dr. Warren was among them, and they cut off Dr. Warren's head. Dr. Warren was, in fact, John Adams' family's personal physician. And so everybody in Philadelphia in 1776, because this was about a year before, everybody was familiar with Dr. Warren. As an aside, they cut off his head and they separated it from his body. So there was some problems with, they thought, they knew from the uniform and other things that Dr. Warren had been separated, his body had been separated from his head. And ultimately, they found some heads. And Dr. Paul Revere, of course, was a famous silversmith in addition to being of Midnight Ride fame. Well, as a silversmith, Dr. Warren also did put in fillings for folks. He did some dental work in addition to being a silversmith. And they actually identified Dr. Warren's head by virtue of the fillings that Paul Revere put in for him, and it was in fact the first recorded case of forensic dentistry in North America that we know of, that they were able to track down Dr. Warren's head with Paul Revere's work. So they formed the committee to create the Declaration of Independence. Nobody really wanted to do it. Everybody thought there was more important work. Adams was on the Board of War and Ordnance. Richard Henry Lee ultimately went back to Virginia. Two things: his wife was sick, and in Virginia they were drafting the Virginians' Constitution. So they got these guys together. There was Jefferson, and there was Franklin, and there was Roger Sherman, and there was Robert Livingston, and John Adams, and Ben Franklin. But ultimately, Adams and Jefferson did the outline of the work. I mentioned that a good chunk of the outline of the work happened at City Tavern over a beer. And still, Adams didn't want to do it. He didn't think it was that important. And Jefferson was wishing he was going to be in Virginia because he thought that was where the action was. So over a beer, Adams tells Jefferson, he says, you know, you really should be the one to do this. And Adams says, well, you're the older, you're the more experienced, you're everybody. But Adams says, well, listen, I'm kind of obnoxious and people don't really like me. And if I try and do this, everybody's going to pick it apart because they don't like me very much. He says, you're a southern guy, I'm a northern guy, and so we need to do something to bring this south and north together. So I'm from, on a similar note, I'm from Massachusetts, and a lot of the bad stuff has been going on in Massachusetts, and if I do this, they're going to try and think I'm trying to drag everybody into the Massachusetts situation. And he says, and ultimately, besides that, Tom, though I have not heard you utter 3 sentences during the Congress, you're 10 times better the writer than I am. Ultimately, Adams' flattery works. And Thomas Jefferson says, okay, I'll write the Declaration of Independence. So he goes about doing his work. June 13th, he actually starts to work on the Declaration of Independence. He's certainly wishing he could be in Virginia because he thinks more important things are going on there. But he does 2 things in preparation for the writing. In preparation for the writing, he looks at the history that we mentioned before and determines that, of course, there's nothing in history that would give him guidance in doing this. So he examines what he starts to call the American mind. And he wants to express the American mind. He does that by, of course, going through common sense and going through some of his own writings about British North American authority. He studies legal cases back to 1760 regarding James Otis and what they call the writs of assistance. He does that and studies these things because what he wants to do is express what the people are already thinking. But he has a group of audiences to talk to. He wants to ultimately address the leaders of the foreign countries that they hope to have as allies eventually. He wants to address the few friends they have in Parliament in England. He wants to obviously address the King of England. He ultimately wants to address the Continental Army because up to this point, nobody's ever really given these folks a reason to go out and die. And of course, he wants to address the American people as a whole. So he's got these 5 audiences that he needs to work with. And he takes, there's a trick that, I don't know if everybody thinks, but generally think, lawyers are kind of creative and they create new stuff and put together documents and things like that. But for the dirty little secret is, for most of the documents, we all have a, what they call a form book that has a format that we kind of pick and choose and fill in the blanks. Even in those days, they had the form book. These days, we have stuff on disks or in the cloud that you pull up a will and then you fill in the spaces. Jefferson pulled out his form book and pulled out a criminal complaint. And regarding the criminal complaint, if you put the Declaration of Independence side by side with a criminal complaint, they're the same document. There's a statement of law, statement of the conduct of the defendant, statement of how the law applies to this conduct, and then the possible penalty or resolution based on that, and it's signed by the prosecuting authority, the statement of the defendant. And so Jefferson actually, while he's got these eloquent, tremendous words that are timeless and they express eternal truths, he actually fills in a form from his form book. And that's certainly not to diminish anything that he did, but it actually, I think, helps you understand the Declaration of Independence a little bit better. If you take the criminal complaint and you take the Declaration of Independence side by side, you understand what Jefferson was doing and what he hoped to achieve. There's one other thing about the opening statement of the Declaration of Independence. They were, of course, announcing a revolution against the king. And generally speaking, when a king put together a royal proclamation, he would start it out with a fairly simple word, whereas. And Jefferson, when he first wrote the Declaration, he started writing out the Declaration of Independence, he started with a whereas. And then as he read it and he looked at it and he thought about it, he goes, well, we're announcing a revolution against the king. We can't use kingly language. And that's when he came up with the when in the course of human events. And that's how that came to be, rather than the whereas, which was the typical way to start a proclamation. That was typical of other times that people announced revolutions against the king. The other things about the historical announcements of revolutions against kings was that the only thing that those folks ever did throughout human history when they were doing those kinds of announcements were announcing that they wanted to get rid of this king and give us a new one. This was entirely different. We want to get rid of this king and we don't want another one. So, and ultimately, he talks about the legal aspects of this, and the legal aspects actually start out with the law of nature and of nature's God. It sets forth the legal reason for the existence of the United States of America, because it's the law that is unalterable. There's two components to the way he put it, the law of nature and of nature's God. When he talks about secular natural law, the law of nature, he talks about something that is observable, scientific, repeatable, unchangeable. I know a couple of years ago we talked about this briefly in a different presentation, Senator, and we talked about the fact that legislatures try to do all kinds of things, but regardless of what, even if they were to pass such a law, they can't repeal the law of gravity within their territory. Right? It can't be done. That's not to say that they won't try. It's not to say that they won't try and they won't try and do something. And another good example probably is the 18th Amendment and Prohibition, because that was the only amendment of the Constitution that did something to restrict liberty. And that's why it was an abysmal failure. because another aspect of natural law is that you cannot order people to extinguish their desire to be free. That desire exists regardless of, they can say you can't think for yourself, you can't speak, you can't do this, you can't do that. It doesn't matter that people will be chomping at the bit to escape those kinds of constrictions. And so that's another aspect of natural law, that regarding certain conditions of human nature, certain physical conditions about the universe, those things that simply cannot be changed. But Jefferson's formulation covers not only that, but the belief of many that in fact what they were doing was divinely inspired. And the divine inspiration, the law of nature's God, ultimately comes out in the same place as the natural phenomena that surround us that are inexplicable, that we cannot change. And so when that was included in the Declaration of Independence, that's included up front as the legitimate legal authority for the existence of the United States of America. And that was the place that set the bar for the rule of law, not the rule of men. About 40-some years after Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, somebody asked him, what do you mean, Tom? What were you trying to do? And in the end, he said this was the object of the Declaration of Independence, not to find out new principle or new arguments never be thought of. Not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. Over the last 240-some years, we've hung a lot of things on the Constitution and a lot of things on the Declaration. But the truth is both of them were written for acceptance of the general public at the time, to be able to gain the consent of the government. They were actually fairly commonsensical documents. And unfortunately, many people have, for their own purposes, made things to be more complex than they ever were. And they were just really expressing a lot of things that are really just common sense. And that's ultimately what Jefferson said about it. He said, it was just common sense. He said it very, very nicely, very eloquently, but really and truly it was just common sense. So Richard Henry Lee made that proposition. The Committee of Five put together the Declaration, started the Declaration, but ultimately Jefferson did that all by himself. Adams and Franklin did a little bit of editing work. Franklin, actually they had asked Franklin to do it before they asked anybody else. And Franklin said, I never write anything that's going to be edited by a committee. I just won't do it. And ultimately, we've been back to those 55 words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Jefferson had originally written, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Franklin, the only change he made to the Declaration of Independence was scratch out sacred and undeniable and put in self-evident. Value of a good editor. Value of a good editor. That really made the thing flow so much better and made it so much more understandable. Lincoln, I ultimately got sworn in, took the oath of office. But that started me on the journey to try and understand what I was actually swearing to when I swore to support the Constitution. And as I said before, 7 more times I got admitted to several different courts. Each time I got admitted to another court, I was a member of that portion of the judicial branch. Another time, a couple times, I was appointed an assistant state's attorney. I was become a member of the executive branch. Under that point in time, I raised my right hand and swore to support the Constitution. And then actually, Article 6 indicates that it's all officials throughout the country. And I was twice elected to the local library board. And when I was elected to the local library board, I became a member of the legislative branch. And so when I became a member of the legislative branch, I had to swear to support the Constitution as well. And I think it's really, really important for folks to understand what it is that they're swearing to when they actually raise their hand and support the Constitution. So Article 6 is something that we don't normally talk about on any kind of regular basis. Creating the Declaration of Independence explains the story of how the Declaration of Independence came to be and what it is as an element of the inspiration that created the Constitution, that created the legal authority for the United States. And I would suggest to you that any study of the Constitution, absent an understanding of the Declaration of Independence, is hugely incomplete. And so I would say there's why there turned out to be 140 references in constitutional soundbites about the Declaration of Independence is, of course, I cover all the Bill of Rights. Probably 2/3 of the 28 complaints against the King of England in the Declaration of Independence wind up as expressions of protections in the Bill of Rights. And so they are so interconnected. They are so interconnected that you can't really understand the Constitution without understanding the Declaration of Independence. I'm kind of on a mission to bring that to people's attention in a special way. And when you go to when you stand up to represent the people, and you understand that you represent the people, and your job is to do justice, and you're driven by the fact of holding the truths to be self-evident, and driven by the fact that the law that you're representing doesn't stop with the law that's passed, but starts with the law that's higher. I think it goes a long way to educate people and give them meaning and purpose. That's why actually folks go out. I mean, we honor these days. We currently have the hurricane situation on the East Coast, and there's so many people putting their lives on the line for their fellow citizens. But they've become fellow citizens because we hold these truths to be self-evident. That's what we are as Americans. That gives us definition, and I hope you'll share that. Thank you very much.